Hello everyone, it's Trevor Horwitz here. I want to welcome you again to another InfraGard webinar. Our webinar this afternoon is called Risks and Rewards, Securing the Internet of Things. As many of you know, IoT, the Internet of Things, is transforming industries and creating massive business opportunities. But from smart televisions to critical infrastructure, our industry needs to protect and manage these devices and communication on a global scale. Today's webinar will deal with a panel of cybersecurity experts exploring IoT security and discuss how to protect ourselves from the T1000. Without further ado, let's get going. Firstly, a little information about InfraGard. We are a partnership between the FBI and the private sector. There's tons of information about what InfraGard's mission is, and if you're interested in membership, please join us at infragard.org. A quick disclaimer that the views and opinions and the content of this webinar are those of the speakers and other contributors, and none of these views necessarily represent that of InfraGard or InfraGard Atlanta Members Alliance. Our first panelist today is Mike. Mike joins us from Bastille Networks. He's the co-founder of the company, and Bastille Networks provides IoT security. Mike, a quick word of introduction.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. I have a cybersecurity background. I spent 12 years running the InfoSec program at Lehman Brothers, and then put on my entrepreneurial hat after Lehman went bankrupt, and this is my second startup, focusing specifically on the wireless side of the IoT and all the network stacks that are out there. So looking forward to our discussion today.
Thanks, Mike. Our next speaker is Ron. Ron joins us from Ionic Security, where he is the VP for Federal Operations. Ron, you want to say hello to our audience?
Well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. As seen on the screen, I've been doing internet technology ventures for the last 20 years, mostly in startups. Now part of Ionic Security, leading our federal operations, and have been in the security space for just under a decade.
Great, Ron. Thanks for joining us. Our next speaker is Vijay. Vijay comes to us from HT Supply, where he is the Chief Information Security Officer. Vijay, a quick word of welcome. Can't seem to hear anything from Vijay. Okay, moving on. Let's pick it up. Another quick word about myself, Trevor Horwitz. I'm the CISO from TrustNet. We're an Atlanta-based cybersecurity, security and compliance company, and we're also the host for this webinar today. A quick word about some of our other sponsors. InfraGard is sponsored by Ionic Security, F5 Networks, and RSA, our chapter platinum sponsors. And today's webinar, as I mentioned earlier, is sponsored by TrustNet. Thank you. Yeah, we're having some trouble hearing Vijay, so we're going to pick it up and see if we can reconnect with him. Quick FAQ. I know many people ask this. The presentation will be available after the webinar ends. We will process and send you a link. It generally comes out within a day or so. If you have any questions for us, we really love these webinars to be interactive. Please go ahead and send us your questions. There's a little send to presenters box on the left, and go ahead and connect with us, and we'd love to answer your questions. We have some time at the end of the presentation. So a quick word on our agenda. Here are the topics we're going to discuss today. Talk a little bit about the attack surface of IoT and why that's so important. We'll discuss one of the critical issues for patch management, and then talk about data security in general for IoT. Touch on passwords, and then a new phenomenon which is emerging, which is bring your own Internet of Things, sort of a take on bring your own device, and how that's impacting the environment. IoT failover, how that impacts us. We'll talk about environmental factors, integration concerns, and then finally some Q&A at the end of the presentation. Okay, so moving on from there, I'm going to start off first and see if we've got Mike on the line. Mike, are you there?
I'm here.
So, Mike, the first thing we want to talk about is the attack surface. So we know that the sheer magnitude of IoT raises the stakes for security professionals. What are some of the controls that we should be thinking about when it comes to securing such a large attack surface?
Yeah, and when we're talking to CISOs around the world, we're finding that they haven't even began to think about their IoT security policy, right? So the actions of an organization typically follow what policy and what they seem as a risk. And they just haven't been able to wrap their head around this because I think the size of it's sneaking up on them. They don't, their partners in real estate or HR, et cetera, are slowly putting this stuff out there without anybody knowing it. So the first step is really it's awareness within the organization and then implementing a lot of the same controls that everybody has been following on the wired side for quite some time. It's knowing the vendors that you're putting into your environment, vetting them, vetting the technology. We'll talk about patch management and that type of thing, making sure that they follow some of the same guidelines that we have. And if they're not, making sure that they're isolated, which can be tricky given the 30 or 40 IoT protocols that are out there. It's not just about Wi-Fi and Bluetooth anymore. So, the size and scope, not only from a device perspective, but a complexity perspective, is getting out of hand really fast.
And Ron, what are you seeing here in terms of attack surface in your operations? How big of a concern is it?
So it's intriguing you bring up the attack surface issues. I mean, as IoT continues to expand, into the billions of devices, most of these sensors or communication devices do not have much of a perspective of understanding security. And if we don't get a grasp around this, we're going to have a complex and compromised environment. So case in point, in the federal sector, sensors, in particular IoT sensors, are becoming more common. And we're actually trying to work with elements of the government to have a better idea of where those points of compromise are and how to actually better manage and secure them and put better points of control around it. So emerging opportunity, but obviously an emerging threat that's going to be sitting on this attack surface.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And Vijay, are you on the line? Have we got connectivity? Can you hear us? Seems like we have lost contact with Vijay. All right, moving on our next topic, which is to talk a little bit about patch management. Mike, what are we seeing here in terms of patch management? We've seen that there's billions of devices. A lot of them are built to be cheap and expendable. How do we begin to tackle the notion of patching? I know it's hard enough for many of our clients who are enterprises to keep up with just desktops and servers and their own core infrastructure. But we're talking about billions of devices impacting a huge swath of people. How do we start addressing patch management?
Yeah, that's a really loaded question. If you just give you an example of how scary of a space this is, if you Google, in quotes, Internet of Things patch management, there's 0 hits out there, which means people aren't even writing articles about it because, there's tens of thousands of different types of devices out there. Again, not all, but many different protocols, different versions running, many years old operating systems, different variants of Linux or embedded Windows, et cetera. So there really is no patch management for the IoT that's unified in any way. The only hope we have is that the vendors start to come together. There's at least 5 standards bodies out there vying to be the IoT standards body. So there's a bit of jockeying for kind of a market there and creating a patch management and operating system management perspective. I'm just adding Vijay to the call 1 second. So, to say that it's a unsolved problem, I think really is an understatement. What we can do about it is, again, know the vendors that we're doing business with, and we're going to have a lot of tactical patching procedures that we'll have to follow. So, for example, you're deploying Nest thermostats within your infrastructure. There probably will be a type of push button update for the Nest infrastructure. But, your Hue light bulbs is another one, and your human resources, Fitbit type applications is another one that has to be managed. And they're going to be siloed. They're not going to be unified into anything for quite some time.
And Ron, what are you seeing here? Is patch management into the vernacular in your environments?
Well, I think what it's going to be is an evolution of firmware over the air type updates, in which you're going to have some degree of automated security patches pushing through to these devices. But the problem has to come with, we don't want to have too much overhead in that information or bandwidth heating up, because most of these IoT sensors are using very low bandwidth or data communication lines or Wi-Fi, wireless. And so if it's not a element that can be pushed out easily, it becomes more complex around the IoT environment. So I do believe it's going to go the path of like a FOTI or FOTA. I've heard those kind of terms, which is firmware over the air or firmware over the wire. It has to push it to the IoT devices. But that's the only way this is going to probably get secure enough, because most of the stuff was not designed at the start.
Yeah, and I think we're already seeing that in some of these devices. I mean, look at what Tesla's doing. They're doing is patch management, updates almost on a real-time basis while you're driving or patching your vehicle. So some interesting lessons, I guess, to be learned from that too.
Well, and add to that, and something actually Bastille has been worked on, and if you were at RSA, you probably heard their story about the mice, the wireless mouse, right? You got lots of points of compromise. So if those things aren't being updated when they're found out, especially at something like that, then we're going to have some pretty serious challenges down the line where these things can be overtaken. And from an external foe or adversary or just somebody who has nefarious intent.
Okay, great. I want to see if we got Vijay back on the line. Vijay, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, great. So
can you hear me?
Let's talk a little bit about
great.
Yeah, we can hear you fine. Let's talk a little bit about data security. We know that data is obviously prolific in IoT, and much of that data is sensitive. Users are obviously very fearful of voice-enabled IoT devices. I've heard a lot of people very skeptical about Amazon's Echo. And one of the reasons is that these sort of devices, like voice-enabled devices, they seem to be listening all the time. So IoT devices themselves may be physically compromised along with their data. So what should we be thinking along, what sort of terms should we be thinking along here when it comes to securing data on IoT? And the confidentiality and privacy issues are obviously some other aspects to think about.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great question. If you look at it, similar to how we treated data security, we always looked at data at rest and data in motion. But when you look at IoT, especially out of experience, what I'm experiencing at HD Supply, we have quite a few of these examples. The RF guns, for example, that we use in the data warehouses or the data locations, physical warehouse locations. We tend to use IoT sensors. I mean, even the Apple Watch that you use today is an IoT sensor. But to kind of connect back on the data pieces of it, in an IoT world, you're looking at data at rest, you're looking at data in transit, data in use, and you're also looking at the standard DLP. So connecting the dots back to your Amazon Echo, what happens is your voice is actually a data packet, and the fundamental security premise, or at least what exists right now, is it's got all to do with encryption of your voice or encryption of your data. So PKI becomes a very integral part of protecting IoT devices. But what's interesting is the type of encryption you can push out for sensors in such a limited space and limited processing capability. You're really looking at asynchronous encryption technologies. This is just a nascent market, but that's a good starting point. If you already have a well-established security portfolio within the organization, extending your PKI infrastructure and gradually looking at sensor-based encryption would be a good starting point.
Okay, great. Ron, what's your take on this as far as data security? You seeing this as a concern?
Oh, no question. And I think the point was just made about trying to do sensor-based encryption is a key element here. We have to take a look at it, and obviously I have a little bias on this, but data-centric encryption is probably very important, not only the endpoints having the encryption. So we're seeing in some of the government environments where they have sensors, whether it's border sensors, whether it's customs sensors, whether it's individual wearable devices, the concern over that information being disrupted or infiltrated or even compromised. And so if we don't start thinking about how that information that's being exchanged between the devices, whether it's one direction or bidirectional, we're going to open up lots of points of compromise in there. And so the government is thinking about this, but much like commercial industry, it's still in its infant stages of understanding how it can be done. And I think the biggest challenge is enabling encryption that has a very low overhead and doesn't take much processing power at the same time, just because of the design and capabilities that are put into an IoT sensor.
Yeah, and those are not a small challenge when you're talking about cheap, devices and talking about billions of them. Building those, sophisticated encryption into that footprint is a major challenge. I'm going to move on here onto the next topic that we had, which is passwords, and I'm going to ask Mike to get a take on this. And one of the articles that I read concerning passwords was a security researcher, and they said, well, for IoT, we should use a different password for every device. So I guess when it comes to a consumer market, you could see that perhaps being feasible today. But even if you extend this out 5-10 years, even at the consumer level, you're going to be having dozens, if not maybe hundreds of devices that you're interacting with. Yeah, is this sound advice? Can we realistically have a different password for every device? And then how do we manage that complexity, and how do we manage this level of authentication? Is this feasible?
Yeah, today, no, right? So every device that's being deployed out there today is very few password or authentication options in general. The technology that we've all deployed across our corporate environments, we make sure that it can do, like a NAC-based authentication or plug into a framework where the credentials can be managed, similar to how you would do a PKI. And again, with the types of devices that are out there with low memory, low power, inexperienced vendors just pumping them out, it is going to be a challenge. And, on the second bullet here on the slide, moving to proximity-based authentication. So the device comes near something, it's in my home, so I'm going to trust it or allow it, opens up a whole nother world of potential compromise. So what is it that makes it see that it's home? Is it because it sees your Wi-Fi network? And how hard is it then to impersonate a Wi-Fi network to trick a device into thinking that it's in a place where it actually isn't? Wi-Fi has been around for 20 years. We're up to WPA2, yet we still find people connecting to, if you saw the articles about Black Hat, there was 35,000 devices attached to rogue Wi-Fi that were put into the environment. So that's going to be a problem as well, because I don't think people have thought through proximity-based authentication. You have companies like Ford partnering up with 7-Eleven and Pizza Hut. I saw a pretty recent article about that, where you pull your car into the Pizza Hut, it knows you're there, does a transaction, they bring it out. You don't even have to get out of your car or even tell them you're there. Again, how is that happening? Who's thinking that through, securing all the moving parts? We have a long way to go there. I know I'm describing the water as we're drowning, but there's not a lot of options out there yet with these devices yet. We just have to proceed very carefully about what types of devices we use.
Vijay, what's your thoughts on this as far as authentication goes? How do we start tackling this?
Yeah, definitely. In a couple of quick high-level thought points, the end of password is possibly near. I know it's a controversial statement to make, but if you think about it, if you look at the fundamentals of IoT, there are two key components, right? One is basically the IoT device, which is a sensor-based device, and the second thing, it's defined as a thing. A thing could be anything, a physical or a virtual aspect of the device. So what's going to happen in the IoT world, and what I'm beginning to notice, is there's a lot of leverage of the thing that kind of improvises your core device. So extending on the previous start on the discussion we had on PKI, certificate-based authentication is what I'm beginning to increasingly notice. A great example, if you look at your mobile devices right now, managing a mobile device with an MDM platform, you could do that with a certificate. This is a natural extension moving in that direction. So fundamentally, we're going to start with PKI, then we're going to be looking at geofencing, as the previous speaker was highlighting here. The next generation of it, we would be looking at what I would call as a different form factor authentication. So based on the location awareness, based on the certificate, and based on the context of the data that you're going to be looking at, a third layer of encryption can come into the picture.
And Ron, what's your take on authentication?
Sorry about that. This is an intriguing challenge because if you don't have some way to ensure that the device is the assigned device and it can be verified that it's the one you wanted to receive information from or send it, there again, just like the world we lived in prior to IoT, it becomes a point of compromise. And if you're not understanding where those sensors are and who they are, giving an identity to it and authenticating the access and the transmission of it, then we're going to run into a bigger problem, whereas those sensors will be compromised. They'll be, we'll get elements that will appear to be something else, will appear to be a certain sensor and actually be something else. It's no different than the dishes we dealt with on some of these man-in-the-mobile, man-in-the-middle type security risks. It's just a different endpoint, different sensor, different communication device that we just have to authenticate and have the identity guide.
Yeah, all great points. I want to move on to our next topic, which is IoT failover. We've seen here that, sensors are the underpinning of IoT, but by design, they're intended to be cheap, and therefore they're prone to failure. So how important is failover, and how does this contrast with IT environments that we're accustomed to set up, with failover as being something that's critical, and in IoT it seems like that's going to be an inevitable downside of these massive cheap devices. Mike?
Yeah, we're seeing a couple new IoT networks pop up. There's LoRa and Sigfox, which are kind of more local in nature. They're kind of what WiMAX promised to be back in the day, but never really materialized. We're going to see more devices start to embrace this as either a primary or a failover protocol. As your slide here indicates, 3G and 4G have been the de facto for failover, but these new networks are going to be much lower cost, and they support lower bandwidth, but they also support challenges in integrity and availability that again we haven't looked into. 3G and 4G are pretty secure from a transmission perspective. You start introducing these like either mesh or low bandwidth type options. You can mess with them pretty easily, especially given today's software-defined radios that are popping up in the hands of the folks that are participating at Black Hat and Hack in the Box, et cetera. So we're going to see a couple new options pop up, and this stuff will be embedded into a lot of technology, either as a primary or a failover. And then, of course, we have to worry about the transmission or the ultimate resting place as well. So every one of these providers out there, whether it's I just bought a new irrigation, cloud-based irrigation thing. I installed it in 5 minutes. I'm up and running. Now I'm at the mercy of somebody else's cloud infrastructure. One little bit in their infrastructure goes offline. I can't water my lawn from my phone, which of course I have to do. So a lot more moving parts in all this.
And Vijay, how does this impact you guys? I know your business is all about supply chain. And how does this IoT failover, how would that impact you?
Just as Mike indicated here, we are in the nascent stages of exploring some of the core fundamentals of how can we even consider this for an enterprise adoption. One of the things we figured out with various proof of concept approaches, number one, there aren't very clear standards at this point for IoT technology, and the way we have been approaching it is the communication path is one failover item we need to look at. The second is the actual device or the sensor itself, where there could be a complete catastrophic disaster you throw away, but there is some data elements that need to get destructed as part of that. The third thing is when you look at all the work groups that are happening in the industry, Cloud Security Alliance has come up with a pretty impactful draft on what could be the IoT architecture. How do we approach it similar to our existing enterprise IT or technology? We are also looking at IEEE's core foundational papers on how does the overall IoT failover work. So to me, the way to approach this has been very simply put, layer it up, very much alike your core 7 layers, OSI layers, and approach it from a layer-wise BCP continuity plan. That way you can at least make it manageable rather than looking at it as a comprehensive IoT platform that needs to have its own default failover. A good example I can give you here is we have been using our scan guns. This is basically the handled units that you notice in various stores. We scan a particular object in our warehouse, and that is wirelessly synchronized with our ERP system to update the stock inventory. So let's assume that there is a failover or there is a failure of the handheld device. Obviously, as it exists today, we just go pick up another device. But the key point of failure for us is if the network path gets breached or if the network path is not connected anymore, how do you continue to transmit the data? That happens to be the primary focus from an enterprise viewpoint. When you compare that to the customer viewpoint, the customer is more interested in the device itself and the functionality of the device. And the last piece to sum it all up, the core of all these IoT-enabled devices is analytics. As long as your analytics platform in the cloud or your hosted service has a natural IT backup plan or a continuity plan, that could be a first step. But we are nowhere near any standards in the industry at this point to say this is a good recommendation to move forward.
Yeah, and if I can add one piece of this, we monitor our infrastructure today. We have Cisco or similar architectures that tell you when things are going wrong, right, on an IP network. But how do you monitor your Zigbee, your Z-Wave, the LoRa and Sigfox that I mentioned, and know when they're not behaving properly? They're very difficult. Very few options out there to do. Shameless plug. Our technology is designed to cover all those protocols, but there's not a lot of options out there. And as you embrace this stuff, not only do you have to figure out how to deploy it, but how to monitor it and make sure it's working properly and not being attacked, et cetera, as well.
And Ron, what's your take? You're seeing this from a government level, the concern over failover?
Again, a lot of this is still in that nascent stage here in the government too. I kind of look at failover challenges really come down to 3 elements. One is you have signal loss or compromise, control loss or compromise, and sensor loss or compromise. And each one has a different problem posed on how do you respond to it. I look at it as you're probably going to have to program and design in some sort of default functionality long term into sensors and the respondent mechanisms to it. Some of this has occurred in the past in computing and infrastructure technology for a while. I mean, a signal switch to the railroad is going to go to a fixed position if there's a point of compromise in the signal. We see this in other operations in other machines, but really what's going to happen is we're going to think about what those default functions might be if any of those 3 points fail, and what the response will be, and then how do we react to it. The element of this that's intriguing is sensors are going to be so prevalent that we're going to have to program this stuff in, and it'll be part of the thought process up front, especially when you think about infrastructure and everything we use on a regular basis. What will happen if a sensor goes down or the comms aren't there? How do I access it? Can I override? Can I get to it through a physical means? So those are the things that I think still have to be developed, and goes back to what Vijay said. So putting certain standards in place and say, if then this.
Yeah, those are all great points. So this brings us to our next slide on environmental factors. And we know that these sensors are operating in a harsh environment, and they need to adapt to extreme conditions. You've seen them put in extremely hot environments, cold environments. And on the other hand, we used to having our IT infrastructure in very controlled, temperature-controlled data centers. How do we start addressing environmental factors from a security perspective? Do we need to go and test and approve every one of these devices before we deploy them? Are there standards out there? Now let's start off with Mike.
Yeah, there are standards starting to develop. There's a couple of nonprofits that are popping up. Once you have them out there, you have to be able to manage them. We've talked about that, but another key point in all this is how do you turn them off? You've put out environmental monitors in an environment, and they're end of life. They continue to keep operating. They're connecting. They're doing things. Bruce Schneier has a great article on this that came out last year that talks about, kind of the IoT waste that's created because these things are so cheap and easy to deploy. So that's going to be as much of a factor as well. Part of managing it is being able to monitor it, control it, and turn it off. But in terms of placement of an IoT sensor, I don't see that as that big of an issue. They're typically very easy to place from a power perspective. They have batteries that last for years or have solar options as well.
Vijay?
Yeah. Now, this is a critical factor from a design language perspective. The fundamental thing for us to consider here, IoT is a purpose-driven industry. Let's take an example of our cell phones. The first generation mobile devices were nowhere near IP67, 68 compliant, but if you look at modern devices that's come out in the past 2 years, a lot of them are. Applying the same concept, there's going to be an evolution path that IoT devices, specifically the purpose-built one, for example, sensors on a drone that's intended to take the abuse of atmosphere at a different level, or a water-based sensor that's designed specifically to be enclosed in a particular format. I don't see much of an issue when it's purpose-built and how it is designed, but the fusion of industrial engineering and the cloud technology to bring about the result, that's where I think a lot of focus is going to be. In other words, there's a secondary market of standards that we are beginning to notice, as Mark just mentioned. Anytime the sensor once you discard a sensor, there's a new paradigm being created, and that's called digital wasteland. What happens to all these materials? That's a big consideration. And what happens to the data, once again, within these chips? So it all comes down to the architecture, ensuring that the sensors doesn't store any data. And how do you ensure that, even if you have to store transactional data, can it adhere to the particular environment before it can distract itself or be distracted from a central control point. So it's an evolution. At this point, I would define it as purpose-built hardware that can withstand whatever we throw at it.
Well, I like Mike's idea of having a kill switch on all these devices. I just have a vision of all of these devices at the end of life exploding so that the data is destroyed. It's an interesting image. Ron, what are you seeing here from an environmental perspective? I think, for government, it's probably a major issue. They're deploying sensors, as you mentioned earlier, in border locations, remote locations, hot, cold. How does environmental factors factor into their thinking, if at all?
Well, clearly, if I'm going to the extremes on weather and other conditions, then I have to design that capability as a feature for the sensor. So whether it's border sensors, cameras, or wearables. I mean, think about first responders, right? You have firemen and women who are going into a situation where you have extremes that vary significantly. They can be soaking wet one moment and burning hot. That comes into the physical design and how robust that is put in place at the start. I still see that those are factors that are commonly used in any kind of environment that we've been in before even IoT. I mean, we've dealt with sensors that weren't connected all the time. The challenge that comes into this is, how do those things get impacted over time? Do they start becoming more compromised or prone to failure because of just, examples, UV rays or heat or just normal wear and tear takes its toll on it. And those are all parts of the environmental conditions. The continuity is as important as, the robustness of the physical element and how well can they continue to do their communications as much as sense and provide the information. And I actually see that as a bigger challenge down the line than the robustness of the chip or the sensor and the casing of it. It will be the communications channels and how that can overcome changes in an environment more than just the general sensor, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's an interesting point from one of you. I've had a recent experience at a client who has actually a Wi-Fi network, and a new tenant moved into their building, and they have some medical equipment. And this medical equipment is actually interfering with their Wi-Fi signal. It really got me thinking about how that would potentially impact IoT. And I think one of the security challenges is, side channel attacks. You can't, these devices, again, you may be able to encrypt data on them and do the things that you need to do from a traditional standpoint. But when you actually have physical access to a device or it's out of your control, side channel attacks become an issue as well. And I think it's something that we need to think about from both the application and the device side.
Ponder this, if I may. Ponder this concept. There's a lot of effort by the telcos, and other firms will do the same, but to provide unregulated low bandwidth signals, let's just say lo-fi type environments. Well, a lot of those are environmentally impacted by not only weather, but physical structures in the environment and how they can change on a whim just based on the direction of the antenna or how the signals are being transmitted. So we're going to see more and more of these unregulated IoT bands, or especially in wireless environments, emerge, and that's a positive thing because it gives us more options. It'll be less expensive, but at the same time, how do you build robust capabilities with something like that can be impacted easily, perhaps by environmental factors, everything from physical structures to the Earth's changing climate.
Yeah, all great points. All right, and moving on to one of probably my most favorite topic of this whole talk is bring your own IT. And if you hadn't heard that acronym before, you heard it here first. So we're seeing this happening all the time. Executives and employees are bringing IoT devices into the environments. And I think Ron, you mentioned wearables in particular. How does that start to impact our environment? Let's go back to Mike, and maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of effort go into BYOD, referring to mobile devices and running applications like Good, since we're getting away from BlackBerry. And so we've gotten pretty good at inventorying that. There's a bunch of pretty mature technologies out there for that. But as we discussed prior, you're not going to put management devices on these thousands of other types of devices that employees may bring in, whether it's something sitting on their desk or it's on their person. So I think it's going to come down to controlling the connectivity that that device has. So they're bringing devices in. Those devices need to connect to do something. Are you going to allow them to hop on either your company Wi-Fi or your vendor guest Wi-Fi? Because once they do that, now they're just open channels out to the internet. They can exfiltrate data. They can become involved in a botnet. Last week we saw a botnet of 25,000 security cameras creating 400 gigabytes of denial of service traffic. People don't think about their security cameras being a risk, other than somebody could get the video off of them possibly, but now they're participating in denial of service attacks. So I think controlling the connectivity and monitoring, is there a new Zigbee mesh network or is something hopping on my Wi-Fi, announcing Wi-Fi in my environment, et cetera, is a great starting point. And then again, coming down to policy, educating your employees or consultants of what the policy is and enforcing it is really key here.
Vijay, what's your take?
Yeah, very similar to a trusted attack model that we all know today in our existing IP networks. The equivalent of that, in order to look at it as the next stage, is going to be signal hacking. And I think Ron kind of touched on it earlier in terms of even signal attenuation could do quite a bit of damage in terms of some of these sensors. But apply all this from a BYOD perspective or bring your own IoT perspective. Here is the approach I think is sort of a consensus building in the market. No matter what footprint your device is, data is still data. Meaning if your data is still secured, your fundamental data security architecture and principles still needs to be applied to the very same model. You really don't want to be exposing the data that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise expose into these devices. A great example is your Apple Watch and iWatch or any mobile watch, if you think about it. Leveraging the Bluetooth technology, you're able to get quite a bit of visibility into what you see in your phone, but the trusted network that exists between the phone and the mobile watch or the wearable pretty much dictates your data control overall. When you take that into consideration as a CISO, the fundamental thought process is always follow your sensitive data and figure out trusted control points before you can unleash it to any of your BYOTs. Now, we're going to see quite a bit of this. Your wearable devices for health tracker, a lot of enterprises actually do the Be Well program, and as part of the Be Well program, everyone is given out one of the Fitbits or one of those devices. The bigger challenge is we were able to successfully exploit one of these wearables. And in my case, I did a demo not too long ago on how to go ahead and breach an insulin pump, a type 1 insulin pump that could be controlled with signal attenuation. This is just plain simple physics. This is not even complicated cryptography. So there's a lot of concern right now when it comes to BYOD. But I would expect that there is going to be certain regulation that's going to evolve, certain laws that's going to get adapted down the road. But for now, this is a highly interesting place filled with opportunity for security controls.
Well, thanks for all of that. I'm going to move on to our next topic and then do a segue into the Q&A. Ron, what's your take on integration? Are we seeing this as being a big issue on the radar for a lot of corporates and government in particular when it comes to rolling out IoT?
Yeah, integration will become more and more common. IoT, I think, is evolving from just an information source that says this is what's going on to a true infrastructure, operation, policy, response type mechanism. Things you're seeing in this government is elements around continuous evaluation of individuals, continuous evaluation of systems, continuous evaluation of activities in and around, whether it's security, whether it's general purpose, whether it's operational functionality. You're going to see that integration become more and more commonplace versus just becoming a reporting tool or a analytics tool. And with that, policies will be integrated into it, how to respond when a sensor does X or Y. You'll see that via APIs, I think, more and more commonly. So that provides great opportunity, but significant challenges for us. So those exposure elements, the integration are just going to be more and more commonplace, and we have to think about it from the start of what impact do they have on our systems, our controls, and our activity. And then I add to that, with integration comes the necessity to put security controls in place. If you don't think about that, if you just let it be a one-way mindset, that is, I get information, but I don't think about how I'm going to control that information, how I'm going to respond to it with a secure perspective, I can't imagine the challenges we'll deal with by just folks who have ill intent.
Those are all great thoughts. We've got a few more minutes, so I just want to wrap up my call with some Q&A. And we had a couple of calls come in from, at least some questions come in from our audience. So I want to take those. But before we do that, again, I want to thank our sponsors, Ionic Security, F5 Networks, and RSA, who sponsor the Platinum sponsors for the InfraGard Atlanta chapter. And a reminder to the audience, we've got another webinar coming up September 21st, same time, 1 p.m. to 1:50 Eastern. And this is on mobile security threats, so join us for that. We'll post a link on the InfraGard Atlanta webinar if you want to join through there. And also after this webinar, we'll post a link that will be available. So let's get into the Q&A side of things. So first question that we had came in from someone in Georgia, and this was from Len. Len's question is, does the importance of secure communications with IoT devices imply that all IoT devices must incorporate secure, tamper-proof hardware to protect encryption keys and to conduct secure communication? So I think the essence of the question is it all about securing the hardware? Ron?
Sorry, a little problem with the mute there. I apologize. Securing the hardware. Yeah, the security in the hardware goes into aspects that we've had familiarity around, which is, preventing points of compromise, understanding how to control the access to the hardware. And so it's an application of simple processes that we've applied to previous environments. It's just a different type of sensor, a different type of receiver. It's just in constant information exchange. So I don't see it terribly complex, but we have to think about it from the start and put the perspectives in the design up front.
BJ, another question here is, what tools or training would you recommend for folks out there who are getting started in understanding the IoT security?
Definitely. So just to add on to what Ron said earlier, I do want to add some color out there. The best example to consider for hardware protection, take a look at the iPhone design. There is a certain aspect on board, on the SoCs, on your core design, and this protected area of the hardware actually retains your hardware key. In other words, it's your one part of your public key that's retained there. So there isn't a standard right now that specifies all sensor devices should have hardware-based location to manage your keys, but that would be the path I'm beginning to see quite a bit of trackability moving forward. To answer the question on, if I heard you correctly, you're looking for what type of tools?
Yeah, tools and training for folks who are wanting to understand IoT. Are you aware of things that are out there that
Definitely
you can learn from?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So let's start with work groups. There are quite a few industry working groups in place right now. As I indicated earlier, IEEE has come up with a standard. NIST has a working session right now that's actually soliciting inputs from various industry panels. There's quite a bit of write-up with that particular group. Cloud Security Alliance has come up with a draft paper that's pretty well detailed for initial consideration. I'm not aware of any tailored training process, but there's quite a bit of sessions like what we are going through today where experts are coming together, early adopters are coming together to discuss the foundation. So I would highly encourage embracing these type of webinars for the foreseeable future before you latch onto something more formal. From an academic perspective, data science, analytics are two fundamental areas of key focus when you're especially considering IoT. A lot has to do with how we manipulate the data, how do we microsize our existing technology so it's consumable, it's consumed by smaller devices. So that would be a good foundational academic thinking before you get into a product-based thinking.
Those are great answers. I want to add in one other resource for folks to go out there. The OWASP has actually put out a list of I think it's top 16 IoT type of vulnerabilities. Great resource. Folks, time is up, so that's all the time we had on the webinar. I want to thank Ron, Vijay, and Mike for everything that you've contributed to this webinar. Thank you so much for your input. And a quick shout out to my colleague Lawrence Tobin, who did a fantastic job putting this whole webinar together. Lawrence, you're a rock star. Thank you very much, everyone who attended, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. And stand by. We'll be sending you a link where you can go and register for that right now. Thanks, folks, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.